Well, guys, after 2 months since we last saw the car, and almost 5 months since it left the United States, the Ferrari 244 GTK is finally back in the US and at the StanceWorks shop. Honestly, I didn't realize how empty the shop felt until this thing was parked back in its space. I couldn't say that I forgot that I owned it, but I did forget what it's like to have it around. After all, it was only in the shop for a few short days after we finished it up before we put it in a container and sent it off to Australia. But now that it's back, we need to put together a game plan. I was not expecting to have the Ferrari back yet. I was originally told it'd be a few days from now, but yesterday we got word that the car was released from customs and we drove all the way up to Oakland to pick it up and then all the way back in one shot, because that leaves us with today to get the car ready, because tomorrow is the first day of GTA Finals practice and competition. We've got our work cut out for us, but I want to make it. This is why we built this car, but we've got to get it up in the air. We got to change our tires. We got to change all of our fluids, and we've got some nuts and bolts to check. We got to just kind of give the car a thorough once over and make sure it's competition ready. We've got our work cut out for us, so let's get to it. The World Time Attack Challenge concluded on a Saturday, and by Sunday morning, the Ferrari had already been loaded into a container for its journey home. It still wears not only all of its stickers from the event, but the dirt and rubber that had accrued from its time on track as well. So a good cleanup is in order so we can tell what's new and what's not, especially when it comes to leaks. Now, for those of you following along on a calendar at home, we picked the car up on Wednesday, November the 8th. That was an 8-hour drive to Oakland and an 8-hour drive home, all in one stint, which gives us Thursday the 9th for preparation. Practice for the Global Time Attack Finals begins Friday morning, so we've only got about 36 hours at our disposal. That means we don't really have time to make any major changes to the platform, so we're going to race it in the exact same setup and configuration that we did in Australia. Instead, we're just going to focus on making sure that it's in racing order. The two most important steps on that agenda are to make sure, one, we fill it with fluids. We had to drain the oil and the fuel before it went on a boat, and then we also need to make sure that all of the hardware underneath this car is nice and tight. We raced it and then loaded it into a container, so who knows what came loose during its final sessions, if anything at all. It's better to check and have everything tight than to find out the hard way at Buttonwillow that something is coming apart. As the torque of everything is checked and bolts are tightened down, I mark it with a paint pen. If I mark the fastener or the washer and nut along with the part it's attached to, I can easily tell at any point later if it's come loose with just a visual inspection. There are a lot of pieces of hardware on this thing, so it is a time-consuming process, but I'm focusing most of my efforts on the suspension and steering because those would be the most catastrophic should they fail on track. Things like seat mounts and even engine mounts are also relatively critical, so we'll make sure they're all tight as well before we put the car back on the ground. Under the hood of the 244 GTK, things are pretty simple and straightforward. There's not a lot of maintenance to do other than checking all of our fluids. I was under the impression that in order to prep this thing for the track, I might have to pull our replacement Quaife gearbox and make some changes, but I actually had a long and very helpful meeting with the Quaife team while I was at SEMA. They gave me a very good understanding of why our first transmission blew up and what we can do to prevent it in the future, but I'm going to touch upon that in one of our next upcoming episodes. For now, it's simply a focus on making sure all of our fuel and oil lines are tight and that everything is in functioning proper order. We also need to perform an oil change because we drained all of the oil from the system before it left Australia. Our Clearview oil filter housing allows us to get a good idea of what's going on inside of the engine, and thankfully, it looks nice and healthy. There's no chunks of metal or any bearing material, so I feel good about what we're feeding this engine so far. As always, we'll be filling the car with Pennzoil's Platinum Racing Oil because it's formulated specifically for engines like this one. It's made from natural gas, which means it's a very clean oil. It's got excellent performance characteristics at extreme temperatures, and best of all, it's formulated with turbocharged engines in mind. We're also going to need some fuel. While we were in Australia, we tuned the car on unleaded 109, but that's not available here in California, so it's back to leaded 110 octane VP race fuel. We've also got new tires to mount, and that's where our boy Eric at Rocco's Wheel and Tire comes in, because his tire shop is on wheels, and thankfully he was willing to come by last minute to mount our brand new Falcon Azenas RT660s. While in Australia, we were forced to run a spec tire for our class, but now that we're home, we can run anything we want as long as it meets the minimum treadwear rating. At 200, the RT660 is a true street tire, but that means it's compatible with any class we wind up in. The 275 front and 315 rears are also quite a bit bigger than what we were allowed to run in Australia, which means the car should both perform and look better than ever before. Even as a street class tire, I've been really impressed with these so far, because even with 650 horsepower on tap on low boost, the Ferrari has been unable to break them loose when the turbo comes on. With everything crossed off the list, it was an early call the next morning. After just 2 hours of sleep, we hit the road at 4 a.m. in order to make it to the first driver's meeting at Buttonwillow. Although we call Buttonwillow our home track, it's still 3 or 3.5 hours away from the StanceWorks headquarters, which means it's still a commitment to get there. Upon arrival, we parked up with friend, mentor, and inspiration Riley Stair, who some of you may remember as the man who built the roll cage in the Ferrari. He hasn't seen the car since May when it was at his shop, so he was eager to see how it turned out. All of the heavy lifting got done at the shop, but there's still a normal checklist of things we've got to get done to the car before it's ready to go out on track. There's the obvious things like making sure all of the wheels are torqued, which I admittedly forgot to do before we left, and we've got to get the front splitter installed. I designed the splitter to be easily installed and removed, and only takes about a minute to pull off, except for the fact that we added steel cables for supports while we were in Australia. Those steel supports got cut during shipping so that the splitter could come off, so we've got to figure that one out before it goes back on track. But thankfully I remembered this and brought supplies, so it's not too big of a deal. To help aid in making sure our US competition debut goes as smoothly as possible, Andrew Molina and Ronald from Haltech came out to make sure that everything on the standalone side of the Ferrari was set up and ready to go. We're not really changing much, but there are some new features from Haltech for the Nexus R5 that Andrew's going to implement within the ECU before we send it out on track for the first time today.
What we're doing here is we're pretty much taking the car up in like the RPM range over throttle position and RPM. Is we're populating a table on what we expect the manifold pressure to be. And once we have that table populated, then the ECU can revert to that table, whether a map sensor failure or more than anything, the fueling calculation. So the acceleration is nice and crisp. And yeah, it's just a new method that we came out with Haltech. It's a free upgrade that we offer, and it's been a game changer to say the least. For the tuner, it's a lot easier to set up. There's not a lot less work involved. But the way the car drives, like it just feels good. Like there's not a lot of latency or lag, if ever. And yeah, it's just a better way of doing things that thankfully the engineers over in Australia kind of whipped up for us, and now we're implicating it on all of our use. Should be good today.
And then we also need to add one more sponsor to the family. As you've probably been able to tell, Falcon Tire has been supplying all of our projects with tires this year, and thanks to them, we've got several sets of RT660s to chew through this weekend. So we made it. We are here at Buttonwillow. We're running the 13 clockwise configuration for GTA Finals. And this is what I built this car to do, so I'm feeling like I'm in my element this morning. Again, I haven't driven this car much at all. It's now 3 times, twice in some test sessions and then in Australia. I drove it more in Australia than I ever did prior, so this is still new territory. I'm still getting comfortable in the car, but I'm excited. This is my element. So as long as I set a PB today, or maybe at least this weekend, I want to go sub 2. I've never done that here, and that's kind of the benchmark. It's not that fast for a car like this, but it's fast for me. Let's see if we do it. If we do that, I'm going to be stoked. So let's get to it. But before we go out on track, there is one final hurdle that we need to clear, and that's passing tech inspection. But instead of a safety issue, we're facing a rule violation. Since we now have a Lexan windshield instead of a glass one, we're automatically pushed up into the unlimited class. We never really expected to win no matter what class we're in, but the downside is the fact that the unlimited class allows for a ton of modifications we have not made. If anything, the 244 is closest to a street class car but fits within limited, and given that we're not running a big aero package or race slicks, we're at a disadvantage in contrast to our competitors. They weren't in love with my seatbelt sub-belt mount, but they said in the end it should be a-okay. I trust it, which I don't know if that counts for anything, but we're in, we're tech inspected, so we're ready to get out on track. Here we go. But no matter where we land as far as classes go, we can ignore it. What we're really here to do is just to drive and develop the car. The 244 only has around 20 laps in total ever under its belt. So any data and experience we can gather today all goes towards making a faster car. It's not so much about how fast we can go today, but how fast we can make this car a year from now. For our first session, we're only going to do one flying lap. We'll come in, we'll pull data, and make sure everything looks good before we go back out. Our GoPros had issues recording our first several sessions of the day, so if you're looking for those full flying laps, they're later in the episode. But our first flyer went well. It was a calm, collected, and reserved lap, but it makes me feel that much more confident for what's to come. Car feels good. It's a bumpy track in comparison to City Motorsports Park, and so I'm feeling it now that I'm actually putting a lot more load into the car than I was before. So it's definitely clear that the same decision I made at SMP, where we need to come home and start making suspension revisions, is what I'm feeling right now. I know that we've got a lot of spring rate tuning and damping to do. A lot of that just comes from, we took a stab at it during the build process, and so now it's actually time to refine it. So after coming back to the paddock, Andrew pulled data from the car to make sure that our fuel mapping and everything else checks out, and I spent a little bit of time talking to Will Dries about what kind of improvements we can make to the car and what kind of improvements I can make as a driver. With everything checking out, it's time to go back out for a second set of laps and to really put some heat into the tires and see what this thing can do.
Hey,
I forgot to press the button to tell it to log.
No.
Yeah. So the ECU's still on in case it would have anything in there, but I'm guessing not. I didn't shut it off.
Probably not.
But I did what I wanted to come out and do. I ran a 158. That's a new PB. That's sub 2, and there's obviously tons of time left in it, so I'm stoked. And I'm hot. But with unlimited track time due to the fact that it's practice day, we wasted as little time as possible and got back out for more hot laps, this time to start actually making adjustments in the pit. Riley and Will were standing in the hot pits ready to make any adjustments, and thankfully were also willing to provide some guidance on what those adjustments should be based on how I felt behind the wheel. Surprising to me, they both suggested to actually soften up the damping specs on our H&R coilovers. The car is currently bouncing as it encounters bumps on the track, and we want to reduce that as much as possible. After making the damping adjustments and confirming our tire pressures are where we want, we went back out on track for yet another round of hot laps. The dynamics of the car changed immediately, and although it felt a bit more loose, I think that's because I was beginning to go faster. The Falcons feel incredible under the car and are providing more traction than I'm able to use at the moment. It's clear that this car is going to go really fast as my confidence behind the wheel develops, and each successive lap allows me to get more comfortable in leaning on the car harder and harder through the turns and braking later and later in the braking zones. By Will's estimation, we were braking into the 157s or possibly 156s during that last test session. After looking at the data from our AIM Solo 2 and comparing it to some laps from Will's ISF, it's abundantly clear that this car has some serious speed in it, and without changing anything, it should be able to dive deep into the low 150s. I just need to get more confident in my braking zones, for starters. As I learn to carry more speed through the turns in this thing and to rely on the aero and the massive tires underneath it, I think it's going to become a force to be reckoned with, and all of this, of course, still on low boost. At any point, we can turn it up, but I think that would just band-aid bad habits as it stands. I think for now, fine-tuning things like the alignment, the suspension spring rates and damping, and just spending a lot more time behind the wheel are going to take us a long, long way. Every single time we've taken the car out so far today, we've pulled more than a second off of our lap time. As I get faster and faster, where that time is becomes more and more clear, and I get a good idea of how much is left on the table. All right, so we just finished, 6 or 7 hot laps, which is by far the most that this car has done. It's really rewarding that it did it. The car feels really good. Will and Riley have been helping me kind of dial in some of the shock tuning. It's feeling better than ever. I'm feeling more confident. We're about to have kind of the last light of the day. Track's gonna close soon, so I'm gonna go out for one last session of the day. I showed up to Buttonwillow wanting to crest the 2-minute mark. It's the lap time that's widely considered to be quote-unquote relatively quick around the track. Now the new benchmark though is 1:55, halfway towards the 40s. And while it might be ambitious to try to get there in one weekend with this thing, this car has me feeling so comfortable and so confident that I don't think it's a far ask. And in fact, if we run the entire weekend, maybe we can break into the 154s. But with that ambition and the push for faster times does come some repercussions. During my final lap of the day, I got a little bit greedy. Coming out of Cotton Corners and into Grapevine, I took it with a little bit too much speed and lost the rear end. But thankfully, if there were any track in Southern California to go off at, it's Buttonwillow, because aside from the egregious amount of dust, it's unlikely you'll actually harm your vehicle. Aside from being sad that I'm going to have to give this thing a thorough cleaning, I'm actually excited that I went off because it finally means that I'm getting comfortable enough with the car to find its limits. It's the first step in figuring out just how fast this car can actually be.
That last session.
Sick.
So, fuck yeah.
Hell yeah.
I got data though. See how fast you're going when he's... Do you see how dirty his car is? Dude, inside. Yeah. Look inside.
Woo! Sick though.
Yeah.
Means I'm finally leaning on it.
Yeah.
What's a little dust? It's not gonna hurt anybody.
Everything looks fine.
So went a little bit too confident. But that's a good thing. I'm getting confident. Too confident's better than not confident enough in this case. Went off, we'll clean it up, we'll go back out tomorrow. And if you thought I was kidding when I said this thing needs a thorough cleanup, you're sorely mistaken. In fact, I'd wager if you had a normal road car with a complete interior in it, you might as well write it off because it's going to be totaled. You'll never get it clean again. The dust of Buttonwillow's desert permeates everything and becomes an irremovable feature of your car forever. Inside, outside, underneath, the engine bay, you name it, everything is going to be coated, and so we've got to put in some extra effort to get it all cleaned up. As anybody that's been to Buttonwillow will tell you, you can never get it all, but we'll do our best. I had hoped to spend the evening hanging out and drinking with friends, because I'm not one of the kind of guys who finds it ultimately therapeutic to clean his car up. But with as disgusting as the 244 is, I knew we had to put in the time to clean it up as much as possible. So myself, Anthony, and a handful of friends came by and put in the long hours through the night to get this thing cleaned up and ready for prime time, day one of competition tomorrow at the GTA Finals.